Book 4, the Euphorbia. Paphnutius had returned to the holy desert. He took, near Athribis, the boat which went up the Nile to carry food to the monastery of Abbot Serapion. When he disembarked, his disciples advanced to meet him with great demonstrations of joy. Some raised their arms to heaven, others, prostrate on the ground, kissed the abbot's sandals, for they knew already what the saint had accomplished in Alexandria. The monks generally received, by rapid and unknown means, information concerning the safety or glory of the church. News spread through the desert with the rapidity of the simoon. When Paphnutius strode across the sand, his disciples followed him, praising the Lord. Flavian, who was the oldest member of the brotherhood, was suddenly seized with a pious frenzy and began to sing an inspired hymn. O blessed day! Now is our Father restored to us. He has returned laden with fresh merits, of which we reap the benefit. For the virtues of the Father are the wealth of the children, and the sanctity of the abbot illuminates every cell. Paphnutius, our Father, has given a new spouse to Jesus Christ. By his wondrous art, he has changed a black sheep into a white sheep. And now, behold, he has returned to us, laden with fresh merits, like unto the bee of the arsinoetid, heavy with the nectar of flowers, even as the ram of Nubia, which could hardly bear the weight of its abundant wool. Let us celebrate this day by mingling oil with our food. When they came to the door of the abbot's cell, they fell on their knees and said, Let our Father bless us, and give each of us a measure of oil to celebrate his return. Paul the fool, who alone had remained standing, asked, Who is this man? And did not recognize Paphnutius. But no one paid any attention to what he said, as he was known to be devoid of intelligence, though filled with piety. The abbot of Anatole, locked in his cell, thought, I have at last regained the haven of my repose and happiness. I have returned to my fortress of contentment. But how is it that this roof of rushes, so dear to me, does not receive me as a friend, and the walls say not to me, Thou art welcome? Nothing has changed since my departure. In this abode I have chosen. There is my table and my bed. There is the mummy's head, which has so often inspired me with salutary thoughts. And there is the book in which I have so often sought conceptions of God. And yet nothing that I left is here. The things appear grievously despoiled of their customary charm, and it seems to me as though I saw them today for the first time. When I look at that table and couch that in former days I made with my own hands, that black dried head, these rolls of papyrus filled with the sayings of God, I seem to see the belongings of a dead man. After having known them all so well, I know them no longer. Alas, since nothing around me has really changed, it is I who am no longer what I was. I am another. I am the dead man. What has happened, my God? What has been taken from me? What is left unto me, and who am I? And it especially perplexed him to find, in spite of himself, that his cell was small, whereas when viewed by the eye of faith, he ought to consider it immense, because the infinitude of God began there. He began to pray, with his face against the ground, and felt a little happier. He had hardly been an hour in prayer when a vision of THAIS passed before his eyes. He returned thanks to God. Jesus, it is thou who hast sent her. I acknowledge in that thy wonderful goodness. Thou wouldst please me, reassure me, and comfort me by the sight of her whom I have given to thee. Thou presentest her to my eyes with her smile now disarmed, her grace now become innocent, her beauty from which I have extracted the sting. To please me, my God, thou showest her to me as I have prepared and purified her for thy designs, as one friend pleasantly reminds another of the rich gift he has received from him. Therefore I see this woman with delight, being assured that the vision comes from thee. Thou dost not forget that I have given her to thee, Jesus. Keep her, since she pleases thee, and suffer not her beauty to give joy to any but thyself." He could not sleep all night, and he saw Thais more distinctly than he had seen her in the grotto of nymphs. He commended himself, saying, "What I have done to the glory of God." Yet, to his great surprise, his heart was not at ease. He sighed. "Why art thou sad, O my soul, and why dost thou trouble me?" And his mind was still perturbed. 30 days he remained in that condition of sadness which precedes the sore trials of a solitary monk. The image of Thais never left him day or night. He did not try to banish it, because he still thought it came from God and was the image of a saint. But one morning she visited him in a dream, her hair crowned with violets, and her very gentleness seemed so formidable that he uttered a cry of fright and woke in an icy sweat. His eyes were still heavy with sleep when he felt a moist, warm breath on his face. A little jackal, its 2 paws placed on the side of the bed, was panting its stinking breath in his face and grinning at him. Paphnutius was greatly astonished, and it seemed to him as though a tower had given way under his feet. And in fact, he had fallen, for his self-confidence had gone. For some time he was incapable of thought, and when he did recover himself, his meditations only increased his perplexity. "It is one of 2 things," he said to himself. "Either this vision, like the preceding ones, came from God and was a good vision, and it is my natural perversity which has misrepresented it, as wine turns sour in a dirty cup. I have, by my unworthiness, changed instruction into reproach, of which this diabolical jackal immediately took advantage. Or else this vision came not from God, but on the contrary from the devil, and was evil. In that case, I should doubt whether the former ones had, as I thought, a celestial origin. I am therefore incapable of that discernment which is necessary for the ascetic. In either case it is plain that God is no longer with me, of which I feel the effects, though I cannot explain the cause." He reasoned in this way and anxiously asked, "Just God, what trials dost thou appoint for thy servants, if the apparitions of thy saints are a danger for them? Give me to discern, by an intelligible sign, that which comes from thee and that which comes from the other." And as God, whose designs are inscrutable, did not see fit to enlighten his servant Paphnutius, lost in doubt, resolved not to think of Thais any more. But his resolutions were vain. Though absent, she was ever with him. She gazed at him whilst he read or meditated or prayed, or met his eyes wherever he looked. Her imaginary approach was heralded by a slight sound, such as is made by a woman's dress when she walks, and the visions had more verisimilitude than reality itself, which moves and is confused, whereas the phantoms which are caused by solitude are fixed and unchangeable. She came under various appearances, sometimes pensive, her head crowned with her last perishable wreath, clad as at the banquet at Alexandria, in a mauve robe spangled with silver flowers, sometimes voluptuously in a cloud of light veils, and bathed in the warm shadows of the grotto of nymphs, sometimes in a serge cassock, pious and radiant with celestial joy, sometimes tragic, her eyes swimming in the terrors of death, and showing her bare breast bedewed with the blood from her pierced heart. What disturbed him the most in these visions was that the wreaths, tunics, and veils that he had burned with his own hands should thus return. It became evident to him that these things had an imperishable soul, and he cried, "Lo, all the countless souls of the sins of Thais come upon me." When he turned away his head, he felt that Thais was behind him, and that made him feel still more uneasy. His torture was cruel. But as his soul and body remained pure in the midst of all his temptations, he trusted in God and gently complained to him. "My God, if I went so far to seek her amongst the Gentiles, it was for thy sake and not for mine. It would not be just that I should suffer for what I have done in thy behalf. Protect me, sweet Jesus, my Saviour, save me. Suffer not the phantom to accomplish that which the body could not. As I have triumphed over the flesh, suffer not the shadow to overthrow me. I know that I am now exposed to greater dangers than I ever ran. I feel and know that the dream has more power than the reality. And how could it be otherwise, since it is itself but a higher reality? It is the soul of things. Plato, though he was but an idolater, has testified to the real existence of ideas. At that banquet of demons to which thou accompaniedst me, Lord, I heard men, sullied with crimes truly, but certainly not devoid of intelligence, agree to acknowledge that we see real objects in solitude, meditation, and ecstasy. And thy scriptures, my God, many times affirm the virtue of dreams and the power of visions formed either by thee, great God, or by thy adversary. There was a new man in him, and now he reasoned with God, but God did not choose to enlighten him. His nights were one long dream, and his days did not differ from his nights. One morning he awoke uttering sighs, such as issue, by moonlight, from the tombs of the victims of crimes. THAIS had come, showing her bleeding feet, and whilst he wept, she had slipped into his couch. There was no longer any doubt. The image of THAIS was an impure image. His heart filled with disgust, he leaped out of his profaned couch and hid his face in his hands that he might not see the daylight. The hours passed, but they did not remove his shame. All was quiet in the cell. For the first time for many long days, Paphnutius was alone. The phantom had at last left him, and even its absence seemed dreadful. Nothing to distract his mind from the recollection of the dream. Full of horror, he thought, why did I not drive her away? Why did I not tear myself from her cold arms and burning knees? He no longer dared to pronounce the name of God near that horrible couch, and he feared that his cell being profaned, the demons might freely enter at any hour. His fears did not deceive him. The 7 little jackals, which had never crossed the threshold, entered in a file and went and hid under the bed. At the vesper hour there came an 8th, the stench of which was horrible. The next day a 9th joined the others, and soon there were 30, then 60, then 80. They became smaller as they multiplied, and being no bigger than rats, they covered the floor, the couch, and the stool. One of them jumped on the little table by the side of the bed, and standing with its 4 feet together on the death's head, looked at the monk with burning eyes. And every day fresh jackals came. To expiate the abominable sin of his dream and flee from impure thoughts, Paphnutius determined to leave his cell, which had now become polluted, go far into the desert, and practice unheard-of austerities, strange labors, and fresh works of grace. But before putting his design into action, he went to see old Palemon and ask his advice. He found him in his garden watering his lettuces. It was the evening. The blue Nile flowed at the foot of violet hills. The good old man was walking slowly in order not to frighten a pigeon that had perched on his shoulder. "The Lord be with thee, brother Paphnutius," he said. "Admire his goodness. He sends me the animals that he has created, that I may converse with them of his works and praise him in the birds of the air. Look at this pigeon. Note the changing hues of its neck and say, is it not a beautiful work of God? But have you not come to talk with me, brother, on some pious subject? If so, I will put down my watering pot and listen to you." Paphnutius told the old man about his journey, his return, the visions of his days, and the dreams of his nights, without omitting the sinful one and the pack of jackals. "Do you not think, father," he added, "that I ought to bury myself in the desert and perform some extraordinary austerities that would even astonish the devil?" "I am but a poor sinner," replied Palemon, "and I know little about men, having passed all my life in this garden with gazelles, little hares, and pigeons. But it seems to me, brother, that your distemper comes from your having passed too suddenly from the noisy world to the calm of solitude. Such sudden transitions can but do harm to the health of the soul. You are, brother, like a man who exposes himself almost at the same time to great heat and great cold. A cough shakes him, and fever torments him. In your place, brother Paphnutius, instead of retiring at once into some awful desert, I should take such amusements as are fitting to a monk and a holy abbot. I should visit the monasteries in the neighborhood. Some of them are wonderful, it is said. That of Abbot Serapion contains, I have been told, 1,432 cells, and the monks are divided into as many legions as there are letters in the Greek alphabet. I am even informed that a certain analogy is observed between the character of the monks and the shape of the letter by which they are designated, and that, for example, those who are placed under Z have a tortuous character, whilst those under I have an upright mind. If I were you, brother, I should go and assure myself of this with my own eyes, and I should know no rest until I had seen such a wonderful thing. I should not fail to study the regulations of the various communities which are scattered along the banks of the Nile, so as to be able to compare one with another. Such study is befitting a religious man like yourself. You have heard say, no doubt, that Abbot Ephraim has drawn up for his monastery pious regulations of great beauty. With his permission, you might make a copy of them, as you are a skilful penman. I could not do so, for my hands, accustomed to wield the spade, are too awkward to direct the thin reed of the scribe over the papyrus. But you have the knowledge of letters, brother, and should thank God for it, for beautiful writing cannot be too much admired. The work of the copyist and the reader is a great safeguard against evil thoughts. Brother Paphnutius, why do you not write out the teachings of our fathers, Paul and Anthony? Little by little you would recover in these pious works peace of soul and mind. Solitude would again become pleasant to your heart, and soon you would be in a condition to recommence those ascetic works which your journey has interrupted. But you must not expect much benefit from excessive penitence. When he was amongst us, our father Anthony used to say, excessive fasting produces weakness, and weakness begets idleness. There are some monks who ruin their body by fasts improperly prolonged. Of them, it may be said that they plunge a dagger into their own breast and deliver themselves up unresistingly into the power of the devil. So said the holy man Anthony, I am but a foolish old man, but by the grace of God I have remembered what our father told us. Paphnutius thanked Palamon and promised to think over his advice. When he had passed the fence of reeds which enclosed the little garden, he turned round and saw the good old gardener engaged in watering his salads, whilst the pigeon walked about on his bent back, and at that sight Paphnutius felt ready to weep. On returning to his cell, he found there a strange turmoil, as though it were filled with grains of sand, blown about by a strong wind, and on looking closer, he saw these moving bodies were myriads of little jackals. That night he saw in a dream a high stone column surmounted by a human face, and he heard a voice which said, "Ascend this pillar." On awaking, he felt confident that this dream had been sent from heaven. He called his disciples and addressed them in these words, "My beloved sons, I must leave you and go where God sends me. During my absence, obey Flavian as you would me, and take care of our brother Paul. Bless you. Farewell." As he strode away, they remained prostrate on the ground, and when they raised their heads, they saw his tall, dark figure on the sandy horizon. He walked day and night until he reached the ruins of the temple, formerly built by the idolaters, in which he had slept amongst the scorpions and sirens on his former strange journey. The walls, covered with magic signs, were still standing. 30 immense columns, which terminated in human heads or lotus flowers, still supported a heavy stone entablature. But at one end of the temple, a pillar had shaken off its old burden and stood isolated. It had for its capital the head of a woman which smiled, with long eyes and rounded cheeks, and on her forehead cow's horns. Paphnutius, on seeing it, recognized the column which had been shown him in his dream, and he calculated that it was 32 cubits high. He went to the neighboring village and ordered a ladder of that height to be made, and when the ladder was placed against the pillar, he ascended, knelt down on the top, and said to the Lord, "Here then, O God, is the abode thou hast chosen for me. May I remain here, in thy grace, until the hour of my death." He had brought no provisions with him, trusting in divine providence and expecting that charitable peasants would give him all that he needed. And in fact, the next day, about the 9th hour, women came with their children, bringing bread, dates, and fresh water, which the boys carried to the top of the column. The top of the pillar was not large enough to allow the monk to lie at full length, so that he slept with his legs crossed and his head on his breast, and sleep was a more cruel torture to him than his wakeful hours. At dawn, the ospreys brushed him with their wings, and he awoke filled with pain and terror. It happened that the carpenter who had made the ladder feared God. Disturbed at the thought that the saint was exposed to the sun and rain, and fearing that he might fall in his sleep, this pious man constructed a roof and a railing on the top of the column. Soon the report of this extraordinary existence spread from village to village, and the laborers of the valley came on Sundays with their wives and children to look at the stylite. The disciples of Paphnutius, having learned with surprise the place of this wonderful retreat, came to him and obtained from him permission to build their huts at the foot of the column. Every morning they came and stood in a circle round the master and received from him the words of instruction. "My sons," he said to them, "continue like those little children whom Jesus loved. That is the way of salvation. The sin of the flesh is the source and origin of all sins. They spring from it as from a parent. Pride, avarice, idleness, anger, and envy are its dearly beloved progeny. I have seen this in Alexandria. I have seen rich men carried away by the vice of lust, which, like a river with a turbid flood, swept them into the gulf of bitterness." The abbots Ephraim and Serapion, being informed of his strange proceeding, wished to behold him with their own eyes. Seeing from afar, on the river, the triangular sail which was bringing them to him, Paphnutius could not prevent himself from thinking that God had made him an example to all solitary monks. The two abbots, when they saw him, did not conceal their surprise, and having consulted together, they agreed in condemning such an extraordinary penance and exhorted Paphnutius to come down. "Such a mode of life is contrary to all usage," they said. "It is peculiar and against all rules." But Paphnutius replied, "What is the monastic life, if not peculiar? And ought not the deeds of a monk to be as eccentric as he is himself? It was a sign from God that caused me to ascend here. It is a sign from God that will make me descend." Every day religious men came to join the disciples of Paphnutius, and they built for themselves shelters round the aerial hermitage. Several of them, to imitate the saint, mounted the ruins of the temple, but being reproved by their brethren and conquered by fatigue, they soon gave up these attempts. Pilgrims flocked from all parts. There were some who had come long distances and were hungry and thirsty. The idea occurred to a poor widow of selling fresh water and melons. Against the foot of the column, behind her bottles of red clay, her cups and her fruit, under an awning of blue and white striped canvas, she cried, "Who wants to drink?" Following the example of this widow, a baker brought some bricks and made an oven close by, in the hope of selling loaves and cakes to visitors. As the crowd of visitors increased unceasingly, and the inhabitants of the large cities of Egypt began to come, some man, greedy of gain, built a caravanserai to lodge the guests and their servants, camels, and mules. Soon there was, in front of the column, a market to which the fishermen of the Nile brought their fish and the gardeners their vegetables. A barber who shaved people in the open air amused the crowd with his jokes. The old temple, so long given over to silence and solitude, was filled with countless sights and sounds of life. The innkeepers turned the subterranean vaults into cellars and nailed on the old pillars signs surmounted by the figure of the holy Paphnutius, and bearing this inscription in Greek and Egyptian: pomegranate wine, fig wine, and genuine Cilician beer sold here. On the walls, sculptured with pure and graceful carvings, the shopkeepers hung ropes of onions and smoked fish, dead hares, and the carcasses of sheep. In the evening, the old occupants of the ruins, the rats, scuttled in a long row to the river, whilst the ibises, suspiciously craning their necks, perched on the high cornices to which rose the smoke of the kitchens, the shouts of the drinkers, and the cries of the tapsters. All around, builders laid out streets, and masons constructed convents, chapels, and churches. By the end of 6 months, a city was established with a guardhouse, a tribunal, a prison, and a school, kept by an old blind scribe. The pilgrims were innumerable. Bishops and other church dignitaries came full of admiration. The Patriarch of Antioch, who chanced to be in Egypt at that time, came with all his clergy. He highly approved of the extraordinary conduct of the stylite, and the heads of the Libyan church followed, in the absence of Athanasius, the opinion of the Patriarch. Having learned which, Abbots Ephraim and Serapion came to the feet of Paphnutius to apologize for their former mistrust. Paphnutius replied, "Know, my brothers, that the penance I endure is barely equal to the temptations which assault me, the number and force of which astound me. A man, viewed externally, is but small, and from the height of the pillar to which God has called me, I see human beings moving about like ants. But, considered internally, man is immense. He is as large as the world, for he contains it. All that is spread before me, these monasteries, these inns, the boats on the river, the villages, and what I see in the distance of fields, canals, sand, and mountains, is nothing in respect to what is in me. I carry in my heart countless cities and illimitable deserts, and evil, and death spread over this immensity, cover them all as night covers the earth. I am, in myself alone, a universe of evil thoughts." He spoke thus because the desire for woman was in him. The 7th month, there came from Alexandria, Bubastis, and THAIS, women who had long been barren, hoping to obtain children by the intercession of the holy man and the virtues of his pillar. They rubbed their sterile bodies against the stone. There followed a procession, as far as the eye could reach, of chariots, palanquins, and litters, which stopped and pushed and jostled below the man of God. From them came sick people terrible to see. Mothers brought to Paphnutius young boys whose limbs were twisted, their eyes starting, their mouth foaming, their voices hoarse. He laid his hands upon them. Blind men approached, groping with their hands, and raising towards him a face pierced with 2 bleeding holes. Paralytics displayed before him the heavy immobility, the deadly emaciation, and the hideous contractions of their limbs. Lame men showed him their club feet, women with cancer holding their bosoms with both hands, uncovered before him their breasts devoured by the invisible vulture. Dropsical women, swollen like wineskins, were placed on the ground before him. He blessed them. Nubians, afflicted with elephantiasis, advanced with heavy steps and looked at him with streaming eyes and expressionless countenances. He made the sign of the cross over them. A young girl of Aphroditopolis was brought to him on a litter. After having vomited blood, she had slept for 3 days. She looked like a waxen image, and her parents, who thought she was dead, had placed a palm leaf on her breast. Paphnutius, having prayed to God, the young girl raised her head and opened her eyes. As the people reported everywhere the miracles which the saint had performed, unfortunate persons afflicted with that disease which the Greeks call the divine malady came from all parts of Egypt in incalculable legions. As soon as they saw the pillar, they were seized with convulsions, rolled on the ground, writhed, and twisted themselves into a ball. And, though it is hardly to be believed, the persons present were in their turn seized with a violent delirium and imitated the contortions of the epileptics. Monks and pilgrims, men and women, wallowed and struggled pell-mell, their limbs twisted, foaming at the mouth, eating handfuls of earth and prophesying. And Paphnutius at the top of his pillar felt a thrill of horror pass through him and cried to God, "I am the scapegoat, and I take upon me all the impurities of these people, and that is why, Lord, my body is filled with evil spirits." Every time that a sick person went away healed, the people applauded, carried him in triumph, and ceased not to repeat, "We behold another well of Siloam." Hundreds of crutches already hung round the wonderful column. Grateful women suspended wreaths and votive images there. Some of the Greeks inscribed distiches, and as every pilgrim carved his name, the stone was soon covered as high as a man could reach with an infinity of Latin, Greek, Coptic, Punic, Hebrew, Syrian, and magic characters. When the feast of Easter came, there was such an affluence of people to this city of miracles that old men thought that the days of the ancient mysteries had returned. All sorts of people, in all sorts of costumes, were to be seen there. The striped robes of the Egyptians, the burnous of the Arabs, the white drawers of the Nubians, the short cloak of the Greeks, the long toga of the Romans, the scarlet breeches of the barbarians, the gold-spangled robes of the courtesans. A veiled woman would pass on an ass, preceded by black eunuchs who cleared a passage for her by the free use of their sticks. Acrobats, having spread a carpet on the ground, juggled and performed skillful tricks before a circle of silent spectators. Snake charmers unrolled their living girdles, a glittering, dusty, noisy, chattering crowd. The curses of the camel drivers beating the animals, the cries of the hawkers who sold amulets against leprosy and the evil eye, the psalmody of the monks reciting verses of the Bible, the shrieking of the women who were prophesying, the shouting of the beggars singing old songs of the harem, the bleating of sheep, the braying of asses, the sailors calling tardy passengers. All these confused noises caused a deafening uproar, over which dominated the strident voices of the little naked Negro boys running about everywhere selling fresh dates. And all these human beings stifled under the white sky, in a heavy atmosphere laden with the perfumes of women, the odor of Negroes, the fumes of cooking, and the smoke of gums, which the devotees bought of the shepherds to burn before the saint. When night came, fires, torches, and lanterns were lighted everywhere, and nothing was to be seen but red shadows and black shapes. Standing amidst a circle of squatting listeners, an old man, his face lighted by a smoky lamp, related how formerly Bitiou had enchanted his heart, torn it from his breast, placed it in an acacia, and then transformed himself into a tree. He made gestures which his shadow repeated with absurd exaggerations, and the audience uttered cries of admiration. In the taverns, the drinkers, lying on couches, called for beer and wine. Dancing girls with painted eyes and bare stomachs performed before them religious or lascivious scenes. In retired corners, young men played dice or other games, and old men followed prostitutes. Above all these rose the solitary, unchanging column. The head with the cow's horns gazed into the shadow, and above it Paphnutius watched between heaven and earth. All at once the moon rose over the Nile, like the bare shoulder of a goddess. The hills gleamed with blue light, and Paphnutius thought he saw the body of THAIS shinning in the glimmer of the waters amidst the sapphire night. The days passed, and the saint still lived on his pillar. When the rainy season came, the waters of heaven, filtering through the cracks in the roof, wetted his body. His stiff limbs were incapable of movement. Scorched by the sun and reddened by the dew, his skin broke. Large ulcers devoured his arms and legs. But the desire of THAIS still consumed him inwardly, and he cried, "It is not enough, great God, more temptations, more unclean thoughts, more horrible desires. Lord, lay upon me all the lusts of men, that I may expiate them all. Though it is false that the Greek bitch took upon herself all the sins of the world, as I heard an impostor once declare, yet there is a hidden meaning in the fable, the truth of which I now recognize. For it is true that the sins of the people enter the soul of the saints, and are lost there as in a well. Thus it is that the souls of the just are polluted with more filth than is ever found in the soul of the sinner. And for that reason I praise thee, O my God, for having made me the cesspool of the world." One day a rumor ran through the holy city, and even reached the ears of the hermit. A very great personage, a man occupying a high position, the prefect of the Alexandrian fleet, Lucius Aurelius Cotta, was about to visit the city, was indeed now on his way. The news was true. Old Cotta, who was inspecting the canals and the navigation of the Nile, had many times expressed a desire to see the stylite and the new city, to which the name of Stylopolis had been given. The Stylopolitans saw the river covered with sails one morning. Cotta appeared on board a golden galley hung with purple and followed by all his fleet. He landed and advanced, accompanied by a secretary carrying his tablets and Aristeus, his physician, with whom he liked to converse. A numerous suite walked behind him, and the shore was covered with laticlaves and military uniforms. He stopped some paces from the column and began to examine the stylite, wiping his face meanwhile with the skirt of his toga. Being of a naturally curious disposition, he had observed many things in the course of his long voyages. He liked to remember them and intended to write, after he had finished his Punic history, a book on the remarkable things he had witnessed. He seemed much interested by the spectacle before him. Asterisk. The laticlave was a toga with a broad purple band, worn by Roman senators as the distinguishing mark of their high office. "This is very curious," he said, puffing and blowing, "and, which is a circumstance worthy of being recorded, this man was my guest. Yes, this monk supped with me last year, after which he carried off an actress." Turning to his secretary, "Note that, my son, on my tablets, also the dimensions of the column, not omitting the shape of the top of it." Then, wiping his face again, "Persons deserving of belief have assured me that this monk has not left his column for a single moment since he mounted it a year ago. Is that possible, Aristeus?" "That which is possible to a lunatic or a sick man," replied Aristeus, "would be impossible to a man sound in body and mind. Do you know, Lucius, that sometimes diseases of the mind or body give to those afflicted by them a strength which healthy men do not possess? For as a matter of fact, there is no such thing as good health or bad health. There are only different conditions of the organs. Having studied what are called maladies, I have come to consider them as necessary forms of life. I take pleasure in studying them in order to be able to conquer them. Some of them are worthy of admiration and conceal, under apparent disorder, profound harmonies. For instance, a quartan fever is certainly a very pretty thing. Sometimes certain affections of the body cause a rapid augmentation of the faculties of the mind. You know Creon? When he was a child, he stuttered and was stupid, but having cracked his skull by tumbling off a ladder, he became an able lawyer, as you are aware. This monk must be affected in some hidden organ. Moreover, This kind of existence is not so extraordinary as it appears to you, Lucius. I may remind you that the gymnosophists of India can remain motionless, not merely for a year, but during 20, 30, or 40 years. By Jupiter, cried Cotta, that is a strange madness, for man was born to move and act, and idleness is an unpardonable crime, because it is an injury to the state. I do not know of any religion in which such an objectionable practice is permitted, though it possibly may be in some of the Asiatic creeds. When I was governor of Syria, I found phalli erected in the porches at the city of Hera. A man ascended twice a year, and remained there for a week. The people believed that this man talked with the gods, and interceded with them for the prosperity of Syria. The custom appeared senseless to me. Nevertheless, I did nothing to put it down, for I consider that a functionary ought not to interfere with the manners and customs of the people, but on the contrary, to see that they are preserved. It is not the business of the government to force a religion on a people, but to maintain that which exists, which, whether good or bad, has been regulated by the spirit of the time, the place, and the race. If it endeavors to put down a religion, it proclaims itself revolutionary in its spirit and tyrannical in its acts, and is justly detested. Besides, how are you to raise yourself above the superstitions of the vulgar, except by understanding them and tolerating them? Aristeus, I am of opinion that I should leave this nephelococcygian in the air, exposed only to the indignities the birds shower on him. I should not gain anything by having him pulled down, but I should by taking note of his thoughts and beliefs. Asterisk Nephelococcygia, the cloud city built by the cuckoos in the birds of Aristophanes. He puffed, coughed, and placed his hand on the secretary's shoulder. My child, note down that, amongst certain sects of Christians, it is considered praiseworthy to carry off courtesans and live upon columns. You may add that these customs are evidence of the worship of genetic divinities, but on this point we ought to question him himself. Then, raising his head and shading his eyes with his hand to keep off the sun, he shouted, "Hello, Paphnutius! If you remember that you were once my guest, answer me. What are you doing up there? Why did you go up, and why do you stay there? Has this column any phallic signification in your mind?" Paphnutius, considering Cotta as nothing but an idolater, did not deign to reply. But his disciple Flavian approached and said, "Illustrious sir, this holy man takes the sins of the world upon him and cures diseases." "By Jupiter? Do you hear, Aristeus?" cried Cotta. "This nephelococcygian practices medicine like you. What do you think of so high a rival?" Aristeus shook his head. "It is very possible that he may cure certain diseases better than I can, such, for instance, as epilepsy, vulgarly called the divine malady, although all maladies are equally divine, for they all come from the gods. But the cause of this disease lies partly in the imagination, and you must confess, Lucius, that this monk, perched up on the head of a goddess, strikes the minds of the sick people more forcibly than I, bending over my mortars and phials in my laboratory, could ever do. There are forces, Lucius, infinitely more powerful than reason and science." "What are they?" asked Cotta. "Ignorance and folly," replied Aristeus. "I have rarely seen a more curious sight," continued Cotta, "and I hope that some day an able writer will relate the foundation of Stylopolis. But even the most extraordinary spectacles should not keep, longer than is befitting, a serious and busy man from his work. Let us go and inspect the canals. Farewell, good Paphnutius, or rather, till our next meeting. If ever you should come down to earth again and revisit Alexandria, do not fail to come and sup with me." These words, heard by all present, passed from mouth to mouth, and being repeated by the believers, added greatly to the reputation of Paphnutius. Pious minds amplified and transformed them, and it was stated that Paphnutius, from the top of his pillar had converted the prefect of the fleet to the faith of the apostles and the Nicaean fathers. The believers found a figurative meaning in the last words uttered by Aurelius Cotta. To them, the supper to which this important personage had invited the ascetic was a holy communion, a spiritual repast, a celestial banquet. The story of this meeting was embroidered with wonderful details, which those who invented were the first to believe. It was said that when Cotta, after a long argument, had embraced the truth, an angel had come from heaven to wipe the sweat from his brow. The physician and secretary of the prefect of the fleet had also, it was asserted, been converted at the same time. And, the miracle being public and notorious, the deacons of the principal churches of Libya recorded it amongst the authentic facts. After that, it could be said, without any exaggeration, that the whole world was seized with a desire to see Paphnutius, and that in the West, as well as the East, all Christians turned their astonished eyes towards him. The most celebrated cities of Italy sent deputations to him, and the Roman Caesar, the divine Constantine, who favored the Christian religion, wrote him a letter which the legates brought to him with great ceremony. But one night, whilst the budding city at his feet slept in the dew, he heard a voice which said, "Paphnutius, thou art become celebrated by thy works and powerful by thy word. God has raised thee up for his glory. He has chosen thee to work miracles, heal the sick, convert the pagans, enlighten sinners, confound the Arians, and establish peace in the church." Paphnutius replied, "God's will be done." The voice continued, "Arise, Paphnutius, and go seek in his palace the impious Constans, who, far from imitating the wisdom of his brother Constantine, inclines to the errors of Arius and Marcus. Go. The bronze gates shall fly open before thee, and thy sandals shall resound on the golden floor of the basilica before the throne of the Caesars, and thy awe-inspiring voice shall change the heart of the son of Constantinus. Thou shalt reign over a peaceful and powerful church, and even as the soul directs the body, so shall the church govern the empire. Thou shalt be placed above senators, comets, and patricians. Thou shalt repress the greed of the people and check the boldness of the barbarians. Old Cotta, knowing that thou art the head of the government, will seek the honor of washing thy feet. At thy death, thy coliseum shall be taken to the Patriarch of Alexandria, and the great Athanasius, white with glory, shall kiss it as the relic of a saint. Go." Paphnutius replied, "Let the will of God be accomplished." And making an effort to stand up, he prepared to descend. But the voice, divining his intention, said, "Above all, descend not by the ladder. That would be to act like an ordinary man, and to be unconscious of the gifts that are in thee. A great saint like thee ought to fly through the air. Leap. The angels are there to support thee. Leap then." Paphnutius replied, "The will of God be done on earth as it is in heaven." Extending his long arms like the ragged wings of a huge sick bird, he was about to throw himself down, when suddenly a hideous mocking laugh rang in his ears. Terrified, he asked, "Who laughs thus?" "Ah, ah," screamed the voice, "we are yet but at the beginning of our friendship. Thou wilt some day be better acquainted with me. My friend, it was I who caused thee to ascend here, and I ought to be satisfied at the docility with which thou hast accomplished my wishes. Paphnutius, I am pleased with thee." Paphnutius murmured in a voice stifled by fear, "Avaunt, avaunt. I know thee now. Thou art he who carried Jesus to a pinnacle of the temple and showed him all the kingdoms of this world." He fell, affrighted, on the stone. "Why did I not know this sooner?" he thought. "More wretched than the blind, deaf, and paralyzed who trust in me, I have lost all knowledge of things supernatural, and am more depraved than the maniacs who eat earth and approach dead bodies. I can no longer distinguish between the clamors of hell and the voices of heaven. I have lost even the intuition of the newborn child who cries when its nurse's breast is taken from it, of the dog that scents out its master's footsteps, of the plant that turns towards the sun. I am the laughing stock of the devils. So then, it is Satan who led me here. When he elevated me on this pedestal, lust and pride mounted with me. It is not the magnitude of my temptations which terrifies me. Anthony, on his mountain, suffers the same. I wish that all their swords may pierce my flesh before the eyes of the angels. I have even learned to like my sufferings. But God does not speak to me, and his silence astonishes me. He has left me, and I had but him to look to. He leaves me alone in the horror of his absence. He flies from me. I will follow after him. This stone burns my feet. Let me leave quickly and come up with God. With that, he seized the ladder which stood against the column, put his feet on it, and having descended a rung, found himself face to face with the monster's head. She smiled strangely. He was certain then that what he had taken for the site of his rest and glory was but the diabolical instrument of his trouble and damnation. He hastily descended and touched the soil. His feet had forgotten their use, and he reeled, but feeling on him the shadow of the cursed column, he forced himself to run. All slept. He traversed, without being seen, the great square surrounded by wine shops, inns and caravanserais, and threw himself into a by-street which led towards the Libyan hills. A dog pursued him, barking, and stopped only at the edge of the desert. Paphnutius went through a country where there was no road but the trail of wild beasts. Leaving behind him the huts abandoned by the coiners, he continued all night and all day his solitary flight. At last, almost ready to expire with hunger, thirst, and fatigue, and not knowing if God was still far from him, he came to a silent city which extended from right to left and stretched away till it was lost in the blue horizon. The buildings, which were widely separated and like each other, resembled pyramids cut off at half their height. They were tombs. The doors were broken, and in the shadow of the chambers could be seen the gleaming eyes of hyenas and wolves who brought forth their young there, whilst the dead bodies lay on the threshold, despoiled by robbers and gnawed by the wild beasts. Having passed through this funeral city, Paphnutius fell exhausted before a tomb which stood near a spring surrounded by palm trees. This tomb was much ornamented, and, as there was no door to it, he saw inside it a painted chamber in which serpents bred. Here, he sighed, is the abode I have chosen, the tabernacle of my repentance and penitence. He dragged himself to it, drove out the reptiles with his feet, and remained prostrate on the stone floor for 18 hours, at the end of which time he went to the spring and drank out of his hand. Then he plucked some dates and some stalks of lotus, the seeds of which he ate. Thinking this kind of life was good, he made it the rule of his existence. From morning to night, he never lifted his forehead from the stone. One day, whilst he was thus prostrated, he heard a voice which said, "Look at these images, that thou mayest learn." Then, raising his head, he saw on the walls of the chamber paintings which represented lively and domestic scenes. They were of very old work and marvelously lifelike. There were cooks who blew the fire, with their cheeks all puffed out. Others plucked geese or cooked quarters of sheep in stewpans. A little farther, a hunter carried on his shoulders a gazelle pierced with arrows. In one place, peasants were sowing, reaping, or gathering. In another, women danced to the sounds of viols, flutes, and harp. A young girl played the theorbo. The lotus flower shone in her hair, which was neatly braided. Her transparent dress let the pure forms of her body be seen. Her bosom and mouth were perfect. The face was turned in profile, and the beautiful eye looked straight before her. The whole figure was exquisite. Paphnutius, having examined it, lowered his eyes and replied to the voice. "Why dost thou command me to look at these images? No doubt they represent the terrestrial life of the idolater, whose body rests here, under my feet, at the bottom of a well, in a coffin of black basalt. They recall the life of a dead man, and are, despite their bright colors, the shadows of a shadow, the life of a dead man. O vanity!" "He is dead, but he lived," replied the voice, "and thou wilt die, and wilt not have lived." From that day, Paphnutius had not a moment's rest. The voice spoke to him incessantly. The girl with the theorbo looked fixedly at him from underneath the long lashes of her eye. At last she also spoke. "Look, I am mysterious and beautiful. Love me. Exhaust in my arms the love which torments you. What use is it to fear me? You cannot escape me. I am the beauty of woman. Whither do you think to fly from me, senseless fool? You will find my likeness in the radiancy of flowers, and in the grace of the palm trees, in the flight of pigeons, in the bounds of the gazelle, in the rippling of brooks, in the soft light of the moon. And if you close your eyes, you will find me within yourself. It is 1,000 years since the man who sleeps here, swathed in linen, in a bed of black stone, pressed me to his heart. It is 1,000 years since he received the last kiss from my mouth, and his sleep is yet redolent with it. You know me well, Paphnutius. How is it you have not recognized me? I am one of the innumerable incarnations of THAIS. You are a learned monk, and well skilled in the knowledge of things. You have traveled, and it is by travel a man learns the most. Often a day passed abroad will show more novelties than 10 years passed at home. You have heard that THAIS lived formerly in Argos, under the name of Helen. She had another existence in Thebes' hecatompyle, and I was THAIS of Thebes. How is it you have not guessed it? I took, when I was alive, a large share in the sins of this world, and now reduced here to the condition of a shadow, I am still quite capable of taking your sins upon me, beloved monk. Whence comes your surprise? It was certain that, wherever you went, you would find THAIS again." He struck his forehead against the pavement and uttered a cry of terror. And every night the player of the theorbo left the wall, approached him, and spoke in a clear voice mingled with soft breathing. And as the holy man resisted the temptation she gave him, she said to him, "Love me. Yield, friend. As long as you resist me, I shall torment you. You do not know what the patience of a dead woman is. I shall wait, if necessary, till you are dead. Being a sorceress, I shall put into your lifeless body a spirit who will reanimate it, and who will not refuse me what I have asked in vain of you. And think, Paphnutius, what a strange situation when your blessed soul sees, from the height of heaven, its own body given up to sin. God, who has promised to return you this body after the day of judgment and the end of time, will himself be much puzzled. How can he place in celestial glory a human form inhabited by a devil and guarded by a sorceress? You have not thought of that difficulty, nor God either, perhaps. Between ourselves, he is not very knowing. Any ordinary magician can easily deceive him, and if he had not his thunder and the cataracts of heaven, the village urchins would pull his beard. He has certainly not as much sense as the old serpent, his adversary. He indeed is a wonderful artist. If I am so beautiful, it is because he adorned me with all my attractions. It was he who taught me how to braid my hair and to make for myself rosy fingers with agate nails. You have misunderstood him. When you came to live in this tomb, you drove out with your feet the serpents which were here, without troubling yourself to know whether they were of his family, and you crushed their eggs. I am afraid, my poor friend, you will have a troublesome business on your hands. You were warned, however, that he was a musician and a lover. What have you done? You have quarreled with science and beauty. You are altogether miserable, and Eva does not come to your help. It is not probable that he will come. Being as great as all things, he cannot move for want of space, and if by an impossibility he made the least movement, all creation would be pushed out of place. My handsome hermit, give me a kiss. Paphnutius was aware that great prodigies are performed by magic arts. He thought, not without much uneasiness, perhaps the dead man buried at my feet knows the words written in that mysterious book which exists, hidden, not far from here, at the bottom of a royal tomb. By virtue of these words, the dead, taking the form which they had upon earth, see the light of the sun and the smiles of women. His chief fear was that the girl with the theorbo and the dead man might come together as they did in their lifetime, and that he should see them unite. Sometimes he thought he heard the sound of kissing. He was troubled in his mind, and now, in the absence of God, he feared to think as much as to feel. One evening, when he was kneeling prostrate according to his custom, an unknown voice said to him, "Paphnutius, there are on earth more people than you imagine, and if I were to show you what I have seen, you would die of astonishment. There are men with a single eye in the middle of their forehead. There are men who have but one leg and advance by jumps. There are men who change their sex, and the females become males. There are men trees who shoot out roots in the ground, and there are men with no head, with 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth in their breast. Can you honestly believe that Jesus Christ died for the salvation of these men?" Another time, he had a vision. He saw in a strong light a broad road, rivulets, and gardens. On the road, Aristobulus and Chaereas passed at a gallop on their Syrian horses, and the joyous ardor of the race reddened the cheeks of the 2 young men. Beneath a portico, Callicrates recited his verses. Satisfied pride trembled in his voice and shone in his eyes. In the garden, Zenothemis picked apples of gold and caressed a serpent with azure wings. Clad in white and wearing a shining mitre, Hermodorus meditated beneath a sacred Persia, which bore, instead of flowers, small heads of pure profile, wearing, like the Egyptian goddesses, vultures, hawks, or the shining disk of the moon. Whilst in the background, by the side of a fountain, Nicias studied on an armillary sphere the harmonious movements of the stars. Then a veiled woman approached the monk, holding in her hand a branch of myrtle. She said to him, "Look, some seek eternal beauty and place their ephemeral life in the infinite. Others live without much thought, but by that alone they submit to fair nature, and they are happy and beautiful in the joy of living only, and give glory to the supreme artist of all things. For man is a noble hymn to God. All think that happiness is innocent, and that pleasure is permitted to man. Paphnutius, if they are right, what a dupe you have been." And the vision vanished. Thus was Paphnutius tempted unceasingly in body and mind. Satan never gave him a minute's repose. The solitude of the tomb was more peopled than the streets of a great city. The devils shouted with laughter, and millions of imps, evil genii, and phantoms imitated all the ordinary transactions of life. In the evening, when he went to the spring, satyrs and nymphs capered round him and tried to drag him into their lascivious dances. The demons no longer feared him. They loaded him with insults, obscene jests, and blows. One day, a devil, no longer than his arm, stole the cord he wore round his waist. He said to himself, "Thought, whither hast thou led me?" And he resolved to work with his hands in order to give his mind that rest of which it had need. Near the spring, some banana trees with large leaves grew under the shade of the palms. He cut the stalks and carried them to the tomb. He crushed them with a stone and reduced them to fibers, as he had seen rope-makers do, for he intended to make a cord to replace that which the devil had stolen. The demons were somewhat displeased at this. They ceased their clamour, and the girl with the theorbo no longer continued her magic arts, but remained quietly on the wall. The courage and faith of Paphnutius increased whilst he pounded the banana stems. With heaven's help, he said to himself, I shall subdue the flesh. As to my soul, its confidence is still unshaken. In vain do the devils and that accursed woman try to instill into my mind doubts as to the nature of God. I will reply to them by the mouth of the Apostle John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. That I firmly believe, and that which I believe is absurd, I believe still more firmly. In fact, it should be absurd. If it were not so, I should not believe. I should know. And it is not that which we know which gives eternal life. It is faith only that saves. He exposed the separated fibers to the sun and the dew, and every morning he took care to turn them, to prevent them rotting. And he rejoiced to find that he had become as simple as a child. When he had twisted his cord, he cut reeds to make mats and baskets. The sepulchral chamber resembled a basket-maker's workshop, and Paphnutius could pass without difficulty from work to prayer. Yet still, God was not merciful to him, for one night he was awakened by a voice which froze him with horror, for he guessed that it was the voice of the dead man. The voice called quickly in a light whisper, "Helen, Helen, come and bathe with me, come quickly." A woman, whose mouth was close to the monk's ear, replied, "Friend, I cannot rise, a man is lying on me." Paphnutius suddenly perceived that his cheek rested on a woman's breast. He recognized the player of the theorbo, who, partly relieved of his weight, raised her breast. He clung tightly to the sweet, warm, perfumed body, and consumed with the desire of damnation, he cried, "Stay, stay, my heavenly one!" But she was already standing on the threshold. She laughed, and her smile gleamed in the silver rays of the moon. "Why should I stay?" she said. "The shadow of a shadow is enough for a lover endowed with such a lively imagination. Besides, you have sinned. What more was needed?" Paphnutius wept in the night, and when the dawn came, he murmured a prayer that was a meek complaint. "Jesus, my Jesus, why hast thou forsaken me? Thou seest the danger in which I am. Come and help me, sweet Saviour. Since thy Father no longer loves me and does not hear me, remember that I have but thee. From him nothing is to be hoped. I cannot comprehend him, and he cannot pity me. But thou wast born of a woman, and that is why I trust in thee. Remember that thou wast a man. I pray to thee not because thou art God of God, light of light, very God of very God, but because thou hast lived poor and humble on this earth, where now I suffer, because Satan has tempted thy flesh, because the sweat of agony has bedewed thy face. It is to thy humanity that I pray, Jesus, my brother Jesus." When he had thus prayed, wringing his hands, a terrible peal of laughter shook the walls of the tomb, and the voice which rang in his ears on the top of the column said jeeringly, "That is a prayer worthy of the breviary of Marcus, the heretic. Paphnutius is an Arian. Paphnutius is an Arian." As though thunderstruck, the monk fell senseless. When he reopened his eyes, he saw around him monks wearing black hoods, who poured water on his temples and recited exorcisms. Many others were standing outside, carrying palm leaves. "As we passed through the desert," said one of them, "we heard cries issuing from this tomb, and having entered, we found you lying unconscious on the floor. Doubtless the devils had thrown you down, and had fled at our approach." Paphnutius, raising his head, asked in a feeble voice, "Who are you, my brothers, and why do you carry palms in your hands? Is it for my burial?" One of them replied, "Brother, do you not know that our father, Anthony, now 105 years old, having been warned of his approaching end, has come down from Mount Courtesan, to which he had retired, to bless his numerous spiritual children. We are going with palm leaves to greet our Holy Father. But how is it, brother, that you are ignorant of such a great event? Can it be possible that no angel came to this tomb to inform you?" "Alas," replied Paphnutius, "I am not worthy of such a favor, and the only denizens of this abode are demons and vampires. Pray for me. I am Paphnutius, abbot of Antinoi, the most wretched of the servants of God." At the name of Paphnutius, all waved their palm leaves and murmured his praises. The monk who had previously spoken cried in surprise, "Can it be that thou art that holy Paphnutius, celebrated for so many works that it was supposed he would some day equal the great Anthony himself? Most venerable, it was thou who convertedst to God the courtesan, THAIS, and who, raised upon a high column, was carried away by the seraphs. Those who watched by night, at the foot of the pillar, saw thy blessed Assumption. The wings of the angels encircled thee in a white cloud, and with thy right hand extended, thou didst bless the dwellings of man. The next day, when the people saw thou wert no longer there, a long groan rose to the summit of the discrowned pillar. But Flavian, thy disciple, reported the miracle and took thy place as the head. But a foolish man, of the name of Paul, tried to contradict the general opinion. He asserted that he had seen thee in a dream, carried away by the devils. The people wanted to stone him, and it was a miracle that he escaped death. I am Zosimus, abbot of these solitary monks, whom thou seest prostrate at thy feet. Like them, I kneel before thee, that thou mayest bless the Father with the children. Then thou shalt relate to us the marvels which God has deigned to accomplish by thy means." "Far from having favored me as thou believest," replied Paphnutius, "the Lord has tried me with terrible temptations. I was not carried away by angels, but a shadowy wall is raised in front of my eyes and moves before me. I have lived in a dream. Without God, all is a dream. When I made my journey to Alexandria, I heard in a short space of time many discourses, and I learned that the army of errors was innumerable. It pursues me, and I am compassed about with swords." Zosimus replied, "Venerable Father, we must remember that the saints, and especially the solitary saints, undergo terrible trials. If thou wast not carried to heaven by the seraphs, it is certain that the Lord granted that favor to thy image, for Flavian, the monks, and the people were witnesses of thy Assumption." Paphnutius resolved to go and receive the blessing of Anthony. "Brother Zosimus," he said, "give me one of these palm leaves, and let us go and meet our Father." "Let us go," replied Zosimus. "Military order is most befitting for monks who are God's soldiers. Thou and I, being abbots, will march in front, and the others shall follow us, singing psalms." They set out on their march, and Paphnutius said, "God is unity, for he is the truth, which is one. The world is many because it is error. We should turn away from all the sights of nature, even those which appear the most innocent. Their diversity renders them pleasant, which is a sign that they are evil. For that reason, I cannot see a tuft of papyrus by the side of still waters without my soul being imbued with melancholy. All things that the senses perceive are detestable. The least grain of sand brings danger. Everything tempts us. Woman is but a combination of all the temptations scattered in the thin air, on the flowering earth, in the clear waters. Happy is he whose soul is a sealed vase. Happy is he who knows how to be deaf, dumb, and blind, and who knows nothing of the world, in order that he may know God." Zosimus, having meditated upon these words, replied as follows: "Venerable Father, it is fitting that I should avow my sins to thee, since thou hast shown me thy soul. Thus we shall confess to each other according to the apostolic custom. Before I was a monk, I led an abominable life. At Madara, a city celebrated for its courtesans, I sought out all kinds of worldly love. Every night I supped in company with young debauchees and female flute players, and I took home with me the one who pleased me the best. A saint like thee could never imagine to what a pitch the fury of my desires carried me. Suffice it to say that it spared neither matrons nor nuns, and spread adultery and sacrilege everywhere. I excited my senses with wine, and was justly known as the heaviest drinker in Madora. Yet I was a Christian, and in all my follies kept my faith in Jesus crucified. Having devoured my substance in riotous living, I was beginning to feel the first attacks of poverty when I saw one of my companions in pleasure suddenly struck with a terrible disease. His knees couldn't sustain him, his twitching hands refused to obey him, his glazed eyes closed. Only horrible groans came from his breast. His mind, heavier than his body, slumbered. To punish him for having lived like a beast, God had changed him into a beast. The loss of my property had already inspired me with salutary reflections, but the example of my friend was of yet greater efficacy. It made such an impression on my heart that I quitted the world and retired into the desert. There I have enjoyed for 20 years a peace that nothing has troubled. I work with my monks as weaver, architect, carpenter, and even as scribe, though, to say the truth, I have little taste for writing, having always preferred action to thought. My days are full of joy, and my nights without dreams, and I believe that the grace of the Lord is in me, because, even in the midst of the most frightful sins, I have never lost hope." On hearing these words, Paphnutius lifted his eyes to heaven and murmured, "Lord, thou lookest with kindness upon this man polluted by adultery, sacrilege, and so many crimes, and thou turnest away from me, who have always kept thy commandments. How inscrutable is thy justice, O my God, and how impenetrable are thy ways." Zosimus extended his arms. "Look, venerable father, on both sides of the horizon are long black files that look like emigrant ants. They are our brothers, who, like us, are going to meet Anthony." When they came to the place of meeting, they saw a magnificent spectacle. The army of monks extended in 3 ranks in an immense semicircle. In the first rank stood the old hermits of the desert, cross in hand, and with long beards that almost touched the ground. The monks, governed by the abbots Ephraim and Serapion, and also all the Cenobites of the Nile, formed the second line. Behind them appeared the ascetics, who had come from their distant rocks. Some wore, on their blackened and dried-up bodies, shapeless rags. Others had for their only clothes bundles of reeds held together by withes. Many of them were naked, but God had covered them with a fell of hair as thick as a sheep's fleece. All held branches of palm. They looked like an emerald rainbow, or they might have been also compared to the host of the elect, the living walls of the city of God. Such perfect order reigned in the assembly that Paphnutius found, without difficulty, the monks he governed. He placed himself near them after having taken care to hide his face under his hood, that he might remain unknown and not disturb them in their pious expectation. Suddenly, an immense shout arose. "The saint!" they all cried. "The saint! Behold the great saint, against whom hell has not prevailed, the well-beloved of God, our father Anthony!" Then a great silence followed, and every forehead was lowered to the sand. From the summit of a dune, in the vast void space, Anthony advanced, supported by his beloved disciples, Macarius and Amathus. He walked slowly, but his figure was still upright, and showed the remains of a superhuman strength. His white beard spread over his broad chest, his polished skull reflected the rays of sunlight like the forehead of Moses. The keen gaze of the eagle was in his eyes. The smile of a child shone on his round cheek. To bless his people, he raised his arms, tired by a century of marvelous works, and his voice burst forth for the last time with the words of love. How goodly are thy tents, O Jacob, and thy tabernacles, O Israel! Immediately, from one end to the other of the living wall, like a peal of harmonious thunder, the psalm, "Blessed is the man that feareth the Lord," broke forth. Accompanied by Macarius and Amathus, Anthony passed along the ranks of the old hermits, anchorites, and cenobites. This seer who had beheld heaven and hell, this hermit who from a cave in the rock governed the Christian church, this saint who had sustained the faith of the martyrs, this scholar whose eloquence had paralyzed the heretics, spoke tenderly to each of his sons and bade them a kindly farewell on the eve of the blessed death, which God, who loved him, had at last promised him. He said to the abbots, Ephraim and Serapion, "You command large armies, and you are both great generals. Therefore you shall put on in heaven an armor of gold, and the archangel Michael shall give you the title of Chiliarchs of his hosts." Perceiving the old man Philemon, he embraced him and said, "Behold, the kindest and best of all my children. His soul exhales a perfume as sweet as the flower of the beans he sows every year." To Abbot Zosimus he addressed these words, "Thou hast never mistrusted divine goodness, and therefore the peace of the Lord is in thee. The lily of thy virtues has flowered upon the dunghill of thy corruption." To all he spoke words of unerring wisdom. To the old hermits he said, "The apostles saw, round the throne of God, 80 old men seated, clad in white robes and wearing crowns on their heads." To the young men, "Be joyful, leave sadness to the happy ones of this world." Thus he passed along the front of his filial army, exhorting and comforting. Paphnutius, seeing him approach, fell on his knees, his heart torn by fear and hope. my father," he cried in his agony. "My father, come to my help, for I perish. I have given to God the soul of THAIS. I have lived upon the top of a column and in the chamber of a tomb. My forehead, unceasingly in the dust, has become horny as a camel's knee, and yet God has gone from me. Bless me, my father, and I shall be saved. Shake the hyssop, and I shall be washed, and I shall shine as the snow." Anthony did not reply. He turned to the monks of Antino, those eyes whose looks no man could sustain. He gazed for a long time at Paul, called the fool, then he made a sign to him to approach. And, as all were astonished that the saint should address himself to a man who was not in his senses, Anthony said, "God has granted to him more grace than to any of you. Lift thy eyes, my son Paul, and tell me what thou seest in heaven." Paul the fool raised his eyes. His face shone, and his tongue was unloosed. "I see in heaven," he said, "a bed adorned with hangings of purple and gold. Around it 3 virgins keep constant watch that no soul may approach it except the chosen one for whom the bed is prepared." Believing that this bed was the symbol of his glorification, Paphnutius had already begun to return thanks to God. But Anthony made a sign to him to be silent and to listen to the fool, who murmured in his ecstasy, "The 3 virgins speak to me. They say unto me, a saint is about to quit the earth. THAIS of Alexandria is dying, and we have prepared the bed of her glory, for we are her virtues, faith, fear, and love." Anthony asked, "Sweet child, what else seest thou?" Paul gazed vacantly from the zenith to the nadir, and from west to east, when suddenly his eyes fell on the abbot of Antinoe. His face grew pale with a holy terror, and his eyeballs reflected invisible flames. "I see," he murmured, 3 demons, who, full of joy, prepare to seize that man. One of them is like unto a tower, one to a woman, and one to a mage. All three bear their name, marked with red-hot iron. The first on the forehead, the second on the belly, the third on the breast, and those names are pride, lust, and doubt. I have finished. Having spoken thus, Paul, with haggard eyes and hanging jaw, returned to his old simple ways. And as the monks of Antinoe looked anxiously at Anthony, the saint pronounced these words, God has made known his just judgment. Let us bow to him and hold our peace. He passed. He bestowed blessings as he went. The sun, now descended to the horizon, enveloped him in its glory, and his shadow, immeasurably elongated by a miracle from heaven, unrolled itself behind him like an endless carpet, as a sign of the long remembrance this great saint would leave amongst men. Upright, but thunderstruck, Paphnutius saw and heard nothing more. One word alone rang in his ears, "Thais is dying!" The thought had never occurred to him. 20 years had he contemplated a mummy's head, and yet the idea that death would close the eyes of Thais astonished him hopelessly. "Thais is dying!" An incomprehensible saying. "Thais is dying!" In those 3 words, what a new and terrible sense. Thais is dying. Then why the sun, the flowers, the brooks, and all creation? Thais is dying. What good was all the universe? Suddenly he sprang forward. To see her again, to see her once more. He began to run. He knew not where he was or whither he went, but instinct conducted him with unerring certainty. He went straight to the Nile. A swarm of sails covered the upper waters of the river. He sprang on board a bark manned by Nubians, and lying in the forepart of the boat, his eyes devouring space, he cried in grief and rage, "Fool, fool that I was, not to have possessed Thais whilst there was yet time! Fool to have believed that there was anything else in the world but her! O madness! I dreamed of God, of the salvation of my soul, of life eternal, as if all that counted for anything when I had seen Thais. Why did I not feel that blessed eternity was in a single kiss of that woman, and that without her life was senseless and no more than an evil dream? O stupid fool! Thou hast seen her, and thou hast desired the good things of the other world. O coward! Thou hast seen her, and thou hast feared God. God, heaven, what are they, and what have they to offer thee which are worth the least tittle of that which she would have given thee? O miserable, senseless fool, who sought divine goodness elsewhere than on the lips of Thais! What hand was upon thy eyes? Cursed be he who blinded thee then. Thou couldst have bought, at the price of thy damnation, 1 moment of her love, and thou hast not done it. She opened to thee her arms. Flesh mingled with the perfume of flowers, and thou wast not engulfed in the unspeakable enchantments of her unveiled breast. Thou hast listened to the jealous voice which said to thee, "Refrain." Dupe, dupe, miserable dupe! O regrets, O remorse, O despair! Not to have the joy to carry to hell the memory of that never-to-be-forgotten hour, and to cry to God, "Burn my flesh, dry up all the blood in my veins, break all my bones, thou canst not take from me the remembrance which sweetens and refreshes me for ever and ever." Thais is dying. Preposterous God, if thou knewest how I laugh at thy hell. Thais is dying, and she will never be mine. Never, never. And as the boat came down the river with the current, he remained whole days lying on his face and repeating, "Never, never, never." Then at the idea that she had given herself to others and not to him, that she had poured forth an ocean of love, and he had not wetted his lips therein, he stood up, savagely wild, and howled with grief. He tore his breast with his nails and bit the flesh of his arms. He thought, "If I could but kill all those she has loved." The idea of these murders filled him with delicious fury. He dreamed of killing Nicias slowly and leisurely, looking him full in the eyes, whilst he murdered him. Then suddenly his fury melted away. He wept, he sobbed, he became feeble and meek. An unknown tenderness softened his soul. He longed to throw his arms round the neck of the companion of his childhood and say to him, Nicias, I love thee, because thou hast loved her. Talk to me about her. Tell me what she said to thee. And still, without ceasing, the iron of that phrase entered into his soul. Thais is dying. Light of day, silvery shadows of night stars, heavens, trees with trembling crests, savage beasts, domestic animals, all the anxious souls of men, do you not hear? Thais is dying. Disappear, ye lights, breezes, and perfumes. Hide yourselves, ye shapes and thoughts of the universe. Thais is dying. She was the beauty of the world, and all that drew near to her grew fairer in the reflection of her grace. The old man and the sages who sat near her at the banquet at Alexandria, how pleasant they were, and how fascinating was their conversation. A host of brilliant thoughts sprang to their lips, and all their ideas were steeped in pleasure, and it was because the breath of Thais was on them that all they said was love, beauty, truth. A delightful impiety lent its grace to their discourse. They thoroughly expressed all human splendor. Alas, all that is but a dream. Thais is dying. Oh, how easy it will be to me to die of her death. But canst thou only die, withered embryo, fetus steeped in gall and scalding tears? Miserable abortion, dost thou think thou canst taste death, thou who hast never known life? If only God exists, that he may damn me. I hope for it, I wish it. God, I hate thee, dost thou hear? Overwhelm me with thy damnation. To compel thee to, I spit in thy face. I must find an eternal hell, to exhaust the eternity of rage which consumes me. The next day, at dawn, Albina received the abbot of Antinoe at the nunnery. Thou art welcome to our tabernacles of peace, venerable father, for no doubt thou comest to bless the saint thou hast given us. Thou knowest that God, in his mercy, has called her to him. How couldst thou fail to know tidings that the angels have carried from desert to desert? It is true that Thais is about to meet her blessed death. Her labors are accomplished, and I ought to inform thee in a few words as to her conduct while she was still amongst us. After thy departure, when she was confined in a cell sealed with thy seal, I sent her, with her food, a flute, similar to those which girls of her profession play at banquets. I did that to prevent her from falling into a melancholy mood, and that she should not show less skill and talent before God than she had shown before men. In this I showed prudence and foresight, for all day long Thais praised the Lord upon the flute, and the virgins, who were attracted by the sound of this invisible flute, said, We hear the nightingale of the heavenly groves, the dying swan of Jesus crucified. Thus did Thais perform her penance, when, after 60 days, the door which thou hadst sealed opened of itself, and the clay seal was broken without being touched by any human hand. By that sign I knew that the trial thou hadst imposed upon her was at an end, and that God had pardoned the sins of the flute player. From that time she has shared the ordinary life of my nuns, working and praying with them. She was an example to them by the modesty of her acts and words, and seemed like a statue of purity amongst them. Sometimes she was sad, but those clouds soon passed. When I saw that she was really drawn towards God by faith, hope, and love, I did not hesitate to employ her talent and even her beauty for the improvement of her sisters. I asked her to represent before us the actions of the famous women and wise virgins of the Scriptures. She acted Esther, Deborah, Judith, Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. I know, venerable father, that thy austere mind is alarmed at the idea of these performances. But thou thyself wouldst have been touched if thou hadst seen her in these pious scenes, shedding real tears and raising to heaven arms graceful as palm leaves. I have long governed a community of women, and I make it a rule never to oppose their nature. All seeds give not the same flowers. Not all souls are sanctified in the same way. It must also not be forgotten that Thais gave herself to God whilst she was still beautiful, and such a sacrifice is, if not unexampled, at least very rare. This beauty, her natural vesture, has not left her during the 3 months' fever of which she is dying. As during her illness she has incessantly asked to see the sky, I have her carried every morning into the courtyard, near the well, under the old fig tree, in the shade of which the abbesses of this convent are accustomed to hold their meetings. Thou wilt find her there, venerable father, but hasten, for God calls her, and this night a shroud will cover that face which God made both to shame and to edify this world. Paphnutius followed her into a courtyard flooded with the morning light. On the edge of the brick roofs, the pigeons formed a string of pearls. On a bed, in the shade of the fig tree, Thais lay quite white, her arms crossed. By her side stood veiled women, reciting the prayers for the dying. Have mercy upon me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. According unto the multitude of thy tender mercies, blot out my transgressions. He called her Thais. She raised her eyelids and turned the whites of her eyes in the direction of the voice. Albina made a sign to the veiled women to retire a few paces. Thais, repeated the monk. She raised her head. A light breath came from her pale lips. Is it thou, my father? Dost thou remember the water of the spring and the dates that we picked? That day, my father, love was born in my heart. The love of life, eternal. She was silent, and her head fell back. Death was upon her, and the sweat of the last agony bedewed her forehead. A pigeon broke the still silence with its plaintive cooing. Then the sobs of the monk mingled with the psalms of the virgins. Wash me thoroughly from mine iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Suddenly Thais sat up in the bed. Her violet eyes opened wide, and with a rapt gaze, her arms stretched towards the distant hills, she said in a clear, fresh voice, Behold them, the roses of the eternal dawn. Her eyes shone. A slight flush suffused her face. She had revived, more sweet and more beautiful than ever. Paphnutius knelt down and threw his long black arms around her. Do not die, he cried in a strange voice which he himself did not recognize. I love thee. Do not die. Listen, my Thais. I have deceived thee. I was but a wretched fool. God, heaven, all that is nothing. There is nothing true but this worldly life and the love of human beings. I love thee. Do not die. That would be impossible. Thou art too precious. Come with me. Let us fly. I will carry thee far away in my arms. Come, let us love. Hear me, O my beloved, and say, I will live. I wish to live. Thais, Thais, arise. She did not hear him. Her eyes gazed into infinity. She murmured, Heaven opens. I see the angels, the prophets, and the saints. The good Theodore is amongst them, his hands filled with flowers. He smiles on me and calls me. 2 angels come to me. They draw near. How beautiful they are! I see God. She uttered a joyful sigh, and her head fell back motionless on the pillow. Thais was dead. Paphnutius held her in a last despairing embrace. His eyes devoured her with desire, rage, and love. Albina cried to him, Avaunt, accursed wretch! And she gently placed her fingers on the eyelids of the dead girl. Paphnutius staggered back, his eyes burning with flames and feeling the earth open beneath his feet. The virgins chanted the song of Zacharias, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel." Suddenly their voices stayed in their throat. They had seen the monk's face, and they fled in affright, crying, "A vampire! A vampire!" He had become so repulsive that passing his hand over his face, he felt his own hideousness.